The situation in the Middle East, which is obviously having a more global impact. And US President Donald Trump has described the Iranian regime as sick, demented maniacs and once again has promised a quick end to the war. Following his meeting with the Taoiseach Micheál Martin at the Oval Office yesterday, Mr Trump says he's way ahead of schedule on Iran and the whole world should be very thankful for his intervention. He also said he's disappointed in NATO and gave a timeline of a couple of weeks for the end of the war, and Trump said he was forced to act.
Excursion to take care of nuclear weaponry in the hands of maniacs. A couple of weeks and won't be much longer. Moving along fast. We're way ahead of schedule. Did you know that, Mr. Speaker? I'm trying to save a lot of money by being ahead of schedule. We're way ahead of schedule. Nobody would have thought, a great war historian told me today, nobody would have thought you could do that much damage in that little time.
Meanwhile, the EU's foreign policy chief says the door is not closed to European participation in protecting the Strait of Hormuz, but Kaja Kallas says it would probably be part of a diplomatic solution. She also says the EU is consulting with governments in the Middle East about how to bring the conflict to a conclusion. And Kaja Kallas warned about the need to improve our own defences.
Europeans must remain laser focused on our own security. Our ability to shape the emerging world order, to defend the rules-based international order and prevent anarchy depends entirely on our strength. And this starts with our defence of Ukraine and how we manage the aftermath of the war.
In other news connected to the conflict, Iran has confirmed its top security official has been killed in an airstrike. Tehran had yesterday denied Ali Larijani had been killed, displaying a handwritten note supposedly written by him as evidence he was alive. Iran launched missiles at Israel overnight, killing 2 people. Meanwhile, senior US counter-terrorism boss Joe Kent has resigned, saying he doesn't support the current conflict. To discuss all of this, along with the growing concern about the impact on global energy supplies and fuel prices, given the situation with the Strait of Hormuz, through which around 20% of the world's oil passes. I'm joined now by Donegal Bacon, the Associate Professor of Politics at DCU, and Micheál Collins, Assistant Professor of Social Policy at UCD. And you're both very welcome to the show, as always. And Donegal, Donald Trump, he's criticised NATO for refusing to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. But is NATO right to stay out? And is this just a fundamental misunderstanding by Trump of what NATO is actually for, given it's a defensive alliance?
Absolutely, it's a misunderstanding, but it's a deliberate mischaracterization, because Article 5 in NATO is a mutual defence clause, which is there when invoked to protect a member of NATO when it is attacked. But the US wasn't attacked. It launched a war of choice with Israel against Iran. It did so without informing any of its NATO allies or indeed anybody in Europe. And Donald Trump's narrative is that this would be over within days, and was already claiming victory, that this was the most decisive military victory in the history of war. And then, of course, his narrative this week is, cursing his allies for allegedly abandoning him in his hour of need, because he's now rapidly developing into a longer war, and this was not something that he had planned for. So, and he's surprised that the allies which he criticized very strongly in January. You remember he dismissed the contribution that other states had made to the war in Afghanistan, for example. That particularly was felt in Britain, where 457 British soldiers died fighting. And this was the only time in NATO's history that the self-defense clause was invoked. That was after, of course, the 9/11 attacks on New York. So, this is now developing into something of a quagmire. The Iranian foreign minister said that this could become another Vietnam for the Americans, because once they haven't decapitated the Iranian regime, they're not going to put boots in the ground. Iran is a country of 92 million. This looks like a long war. The longer that the war persists, the more advantages seem to be in the hands of the Iranians, who are able to cut off that oil and gas supply to much of the world.
And we're seeing that this is a war that didn't even have to happen. Of news coming out in the last day or two about those talks with Iran on a nuclear deal. And Jonathan Powell, who's Britain's national security advisor, he was at those talks between the US and Iran. And in his judgment, and he wasn't the only one who said this, the offer made by Iran on its nuclear program was significant enough to prevent going to war. He thought progress had been made in Geneva late last month, and that the deal proposed by Iran was surprising, but that something positive could come from it. And then just 2 days after the talks ended, the US and Israel launched this attack on Iran. What do you make of that, Donncha? Probably not surprised.
No, I'm not surprised. And I mean, Jonathan Powell has an interesting history with our country. He was intimately involved with the Blair administration in negotiating the Good Friday Agreement, produced a very interesting memoir on that subject, has extensive experience when it comes to reaching agreements and diplomatic negotiations. So I would put a lot of stead into his analysis of this, that this was an unnecessary war, that the Iranians were moving very close to a final deal. And as I said, it is a war of choice, and it is a war that the US has no allies apart from Israel. And it seems that, and this goes back to Joe Kent's resignation, which you mentioned in your introduction, it seems that the US has been dragged into this war by Israel, because it's not certainly in US interest. This is Joe Kent's point, that there was no imminent threat to the United States. And it's an unpopular war from the very beginning. I mean, most times when America goes to war, there is this kind of surge of patriotism, of rallying behind the flag and the president. And you get, for example, with the invasion of Afghanistan, or the attacks in Afghanistan in 2001, there was a 90% plus kind of approval rating for the war, at least at the beginning. With this war, you have minority support from the very, very beginning. So it's only going down from there.
Yeah, and I do want to come back to Joe Kent's resignation and just how significant that is and might turn out to be going forward the longer this conflict goes on. But I want to bring in Micheál Collins now. Micheál, a lot of talk. People have become a lot more familiar with the Strait of Hormuz than they might have been beforehand, and some would say that maybe that one of the many mistakes the Trump administration had made, that they weren't as aware of the significance of the Strait of Hormuz as perhaps they should have been prior to getting themselves involved in this. Just how significant from a fuel perspective, fuel supply, is the current disruption, and what it means for inflation globally. And just right now, we might touch later on how much worse it could get, given we don't know how long this conflict's going to continue for.
Yeah, it's funny, Alan, how explicitly linked the Strait of Hormuz is to the fuel that you and I and everybody else end up buying, and therefore, our cost of living just decades later after the oil crisis in the Middle East in the 70s, we're still in a kind of place where oil remains, despite all our efforts, such a kind of dominant aspect of our living standards. And then when its price changes, it has very, very big effects. Certainly the very fact that, we think about oil a lot, but there's a lot of gas that's moving through the Strait of Hormuz as well. Our electricity prices, for better or worse, you can have a long argument about that. Generally, the answer is worse, are set by the price of gas. And so I think we're beginning to see, or we have seen already, oil prices internationally moved up. So we went into all of this around $60, $70 a barrel. We've crossed $100 a barrel now. There's a kind of hope, which I would have shared, that this might end fairly rapidly. I think the opportunity that Donald Trump had to end this, whether he should have started it is a very fair question, but at least to end it rapidly, past about 10 days, 2 weeks ago, that's gone now. And I agree with where Donncha was coming from, that we're into probably a protracted war here, or even if the war sort of peters out in some way, there'll be kind of legacy effects. And that means, I suppose, Alan, that's going to kick across into the ongoing cost of fuel as well. So we're beginning to see that internationally. It's interesting when you look at the markets, they expect, their read of it is that by the end of this year, oil will be down to about $75 a barrel. So that things should improve, but they'll still be worse than where we started. And I suppose for the world and for inflation and for you and me as part of that, that means that prices are rising already and will continue to for a while.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that in terms of just how much higher they could get, or whether if there is a fall in the price of a barrel of oil, whether we'll see the prices come down as quick as they rose. But to return to you, Donncha, I played a clip from Kaja Kallas just a little while ago, and we've seen Emmanuel Macron, of course, French leader as well, saying this is not our war. We've seen I suppose a gentle rebuttal or a turning down from other countries, not just European ones as well, in terms of Trump's call for help in tackling the issue with the Strait of Hormuz. But just focusing on Europe, how significant is it in terms of a turning point on how Europe not just views the US leadership but reacts to it? Because I guess there's been a lot of criticism up to now, certainly from many Europeans, that they have seemed, and you think of the example of the Turnberry deal on the tariffs, as very weak and obsequious. Is this finally a sign, maybe it's as a consequence of what happened in Greenland as well, where they've seen that showing deference to Trump doesn't work?
Well, look, the transatlantic alliance is, in many respects, over, at least the transatlantic alliance that we knew it. There's certainly no affection or love in this marriage between the United States and the European Union, but the European Union has managed to get itself into multiple simultaneous addictions over the last couple of decades. They've become addicted to cheap Russian energy. They've become addicted to a cheap US security blanket, and they've become addicted to cheap Chinese labor producing lots of goods for our products. And two of those three at least have been severed to a large degree in the last couple of years. First through Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That's led to this kind of crisis management situation where we've tried to redirect European energy supplies away from Russia into alternative sources. And now with Donald Trump, you're seeing the withdrawal of that security guarantee. I mean, he made it quite clear in his meeting with the Taoiseach yesterday. He was talking vaguely about how disappointed he was that, the Europeans hadn't come to his aid in the Middle East, even though, again, they weren't consulted. And of course, they had no sense of what his exit strategy was, and that this was after decades of American support for Europe. And he made reference to Ukraine as well, even though, of course, the Trump administration has withdrawn all US aid from Ukraine. But he was trying to say that there was credit built up over many decades. And now the US, when it was trying to get something in return, was getting nothing. So he was certainly creating, I don't think that, the Europeans, as I said, are trying to build up resilience right now. So they're going to be very, very wary of being the ones to call off this relationship formally. The plan is, I think, to build up resilience and then suffer the consequences when they come. I think Trump, given his temperamental, nature and adversarial nature, may be the one who will call it a day before the Europeans are ready. And that's the risk. I mean, because Europe is not ready to take on the burden of securing European territory by itself. And that's a failure, of course, for Europe. It's something, of course, that should never have been allowed to happen. But as I said, multiple addictions were, allowed to develop over several decades. And we're only now dealing with the repercussions of that.
Yeah, and Micheál, we've spoken about how consumers here in this country, how we're feeling it at the service stations. Seen petrol anywhere in around the mid 180s up to nearly €1.90, diesel even up to €2.10. I'm sure people will text in or WhatsApp in telling me they've seen it even more expensive elsewhere. Airlines already warning of higher costs, and we've seen farmers warning about the issues with fertiliser, because around 30% of the world's fertiliser comes through the Strait of Hormuz, and that we could see the cost of food rise. And this is Bill O'Keefe, the chair of the IFA Farm Business Committee, speaking about that. And he says that the cost of producing and delivering food is already rising.
Fertiliser costs are gone through the roof for farmers on the ground, and green diesel has gone through the roof for farmers on the ground. So the cost of producing food is rising rapidly on farm, and it's at a time of year in the spring when a lot of crops are going into the ground. So it's directly affecting this year's crops as we go through the year. You'll see food prices rising quicker than that to the consumer from transport costs.
So, warning there from Bill O'Keefe, Micheál. We're not just going to see it at service stations, we'll see it on the supermarket shelves. And not to be trying not to be too pessimistic about this situation, trying to be more realistic than anything else. But where else do you foresee costs rising dramatically?
Yeah, it's going to be across the economy, Alan, for sure. And so, it becomes very visible initially, as we're seeing it with the petrol and the diesel and the home heating oil. But then rather rapidly, the other things are starting to kick in. I mean, to a great degree, our gas prices and our electricity prices haven't gone up yet, but they will. And when they do, then that will kick across to see the prices of everything else in the economy increasing. So I won't give you a list, Alan, because it's everything, and it's going to go across to everything. But we're going to see it, very visibly. Transport is something clearly where there'll be very rapid pass-throughs as well. And as you said a while ago, there's the challenge here of those appearing initially, and then they tend to be a bit sticky and very slow to reverse out, if reversing out at all, or those prices tend to stay higher. Certainly if this persists for a while, and kind of the great challenge here is the unknown challenge of how long will this be, and how long will the tail effect be and how long will that impact on our prices. So we don't quite know that, but I think everything is going to get higher. So we're going to go from inflation, that had peaked, that had come back down again, to that general measure of prices in the economy, inflation, which will start to creep up again. And of course, really what that means and what inflation is all about, I suppose we've learned this over the last few years, is that it means that the money in your pocket buys less, and therefore people's living standards across the board will fall for a period on foot of this.
Donnacha, I just wonder about how two figures in this whole saga exiting the stage, albeit for very different reasons, will affect both the US and Iran. You touched on, we mentioned Joe Kent's resignation briefly. How significant a blow is that to Trump, that he's gone as their senior US counter-terrorism chief, and also the death of Iran's top security official, Ari Larijani, in an Israeli strike? How big a blow is that to the Iranian regime?
Major long-term implications with Joe Kent. He was a Trump appointee. He was a MAGA loyalist. He can be easily replaced by another MAGA loyalist. He doesn't have a support base of his own. So this is, if even a one-day story in the US, it is of no longer significance. In terms of Iran, the regime has already suffered a decapitation of sorts. Some key individuals, of course, including the Ayatollah, though he was elderly, are gone, now replaced by his son. But as I've mentioned earlier, Iran has a population of 92 million people. It has, quite a depth still in terms of resources, in terms of personnel, and nobody is expendable. I think the risk actually for the US is that often when you get individuals assassinated or executed, those who come up afterwards are often younger and more radical. And indeed, those who have come up, like the Ayatollah's son, the new Khomeini, when his father was killed, his wife was also killed, his sister was killed. This is hardly the way to, pave the way for negotiated settlement. You're radicalizing the people that you want to ultimately seek agreement with. So it's, I don't see an exit strategy right now. Many would say that Trump didn't even go into this war of choice with a clear exit strategy, or even a clear definition of what victory was. You could end up in a situation where all sides, US, Israel, and Iran, claim victory of sorts if this war peters out, because all the Iranian regime has to do is to survive to claim victory. Because, of course, the aim was, at least in the very first statements that were made by Donald Trump, is that they wanted regime change. So if the regime survives, then, of course, they claim victory. For Donald Trump, he'll simply say, perhaps, that he's degraded the Iranian military. He stopped a threat of a nuclear weapon, which wasn't imminent anyway. And I think that's how it will probably end. If it ends, of course, it'll come down really to Donald Trump. But as was already argued by Micheál, the legacy effects of this conflict could go on for some time, particularly the economic ones.
Yeah, and on the economic ones, Micheál, we've heard calls, certainly in relation to fuel prices, for the government to help out, to bring in something like the energy credits we saw in recent budgets. Don't seem minded to go down that route, but are there any short-term measures the government, given that, as you've mentioned, it's not just going to be in fuel, it's going to be across the board, we'll see price increases, at least on fuel and energy? Can the government, and should the government, do something, particularly with fuel and the amount of excise and duty and tax and so on, that VAT that the government makes from that? Should they look at least temporarily reducing those to give consumers a bit of relief?
Yeah, the interesting thing, Alan, of course, is that as the price of these things go up, the government takes its proportion in VAT and things like that. It's one of the big ways it takes its income from it. And of course, therefore, that government revenue rises as well. I think government are probably forced at this point, and they were probably waiting to see how long would this persist. Would it persist at all? The fact that it's sitting there now and beginning to have an impact, and would seem, if you take even Donald Trump's lines, that it's going to last for a couple of more weeks, means the government will act in some way. So I think you would expect to see some initial movements like the fuel allowance that's paid. I think government will move away from universal payments and focus on targeted payments to social welfare recipients, at least initially. And so the fuel allowance that's paid on a weekly basis to particular households dependent on social welfare That fuel allowance period is supposed to end over the next month or so. I expect government will extend that, for example, and then they'll begin to look at some of the ways in which they topped up people's incomes over the cost of living crisis, using the living alone allowance, using the fuel allowance, using the child support payments and others to target money at particular households. And I think they'll begin to explore some of that. The experience during the cost of living crisis was that the government did a bit. They went away to see what happened. It kept going. They came back and did a bit more and so on. And I think we're going to begin to see that replayed again over the next weeks and indeed perhaps months.
Okay, final brief word to you, Donncha. I know we know you're not Mystic Meg, but Donald Trump claiming this will be over in weeks. Although, you can't take what he says on this at face value. Between his prediction of it being over within weeks and a Ukraine-Russia style war, where 4 years in and no sign of it ending, where is this conflict on that scale? Do you think?
Well, I think the US commitment, which is costing them $1 billion every day, will end rather soon. I think we are talking in terms of weeks, because they can unilaterally withdraw at any time. As I said, this is a war of choice, even though the Iranians may consider, having these kind of guerrilla economic tactics for some time afterwards. It won't be anything like Russia and Ukraine, because, of course, Russia's committed troops to fight in Ukraine. It's quite clear that the US isn't going to commit troops to Iran. It wanted regime change on the cheap. It's worth mentioning, of course, of one of the major beneficiaries of this war. I mean, there are so many losers, not least the people in Iran. But one of the big beneficiaries is Russia, because, of course, this spike in the price of oil and gas has filled the coffers of Russia. So we'll see, I think, perhaps this particular war, the US-Iran war, the hot phase of it, end rather soon, but it may prolong the other war, the more long-standing war between Russia and Ukraine, as Russia now has more money to prosecute its war against Ukraine.
Okay, we do have to leave it there, but always appreciate both of you joining me on these matters. That's Professor Donncha O'Bachan, and also with us was Professor Micheál Collins.